This might seem like a regular house, but in 2023, it was the site of a deeply concerning proposal. Locals warned that it would result in complete chaos. The sense of community cohesion that they cherished would slowly erode due to parking disputes, disagreements among neighbors, and the increased number of unknown people in the area. There were even concerns about bears eating children. That proposal? A daycare. Yes, a daycare in the city of Port Coquitlam. Those were the concerns raised by 9 residents who showed up at a city council meeting to protest this daycare, which led to the councilors rejecting it.
Opposed? All right, it fails.
Hooray! But for me, what happened in Port Coquitlam isn't just trivial local politics. I think it's representative of a much larger problem that cities across North America are grappling with. One that's getting in the way of housing, infrastructure, and other important projects. The public hearing.
I and my neighbors support affordable housing, but this proposal is not the right fit.
The project is wrong for our neighborhood, and I ask you to reject it.
To start, what is a public hearing? Well, a public hearing is a meeting where elected officials invite the general public to give feedback on a new project in their city. Here's how it works. A representative for the project first gives a presentation on their proposal, and then members of the public who want to speak have a chance to tell their local government what they think about it, usually for a few minutes. After everyone's comments, the elected officials then vote to approve or reject the project. This meeting is open to anyone and everyone, whether you're a renter, a homeowner, or Dave Chappelle.
You look like clowns. I am not.
Most cities across North America are required to hold these public hearings as part of their decision-making process, and it's this kind of forum that residents use to protest this daycare in Port Coquitlam.
Child care facility might have an adverse effect on the property value, potentially impacting homeowners.
Now, public hearings are a good idea in theory. If there's a significant change being proposed for the city, the general public should be able to weigh in on it, right? But recently, they've come under scrutiny. In fact, some places like my hometown of British Columbia have begun prohibiting public hearings for certain housing developments. Despite their good intentions, it turns out public hearings can also be a bit problematic. For starters, they can really clog up local decision-making. You might think that inviting the whole town to a public hearing would be reserved for big, consequential decisions about our city. But actually, most public hearings in North America are held for more basic changes.
I'd like to build a townhouse on a lot that is zoned for single-family residential.
That's a public hearing.
I'd like to build a daycare on my property in a residential zone.
That's a public hearing.
I'd like to open up a grocery store on the bottom floor of my house.
That's a good idea, but it's also a public hearing. Here in Metro Vancouver, the 10 largest municipalities regularly send hundreds of projects for public hearings every year. These can be intense and exhausting meetings. One public hearing over a social housing project in Vancouver took 6 days with 300 people speaking over 35 hours. 35 hours of council time for one building. Public hearings can also lack decorum.
Wales, a man arrested and accusations of racism.
You can leave extremely difficult.
You're the problem.
You will respect the process. This is not some kind of a theater or a carnival.
And regardless of the drama, public hearings ultimately do add a real cost onto projects. A study by SFU's Renovate the Public Hearing initiative looked into how the development application and public hearing process impact housing projects, and the case studies are eye-opening. In this nonprofit housing project at the Vancouver First Church of Nazarene, the congregation has spent $1.1 million just on the development application and public hearing process so far. At this anonymized housing development in BC, the project team spent $1.1 million on just landholding costs, while the project waited for its public hearing date. This is money literally just spent on interest payments to a bank. And this non-market housing project in Surrey aimed at families, seniors, students, and residents with intellectual disabilities was rejected at a public hearing But interestingly, when roughly the same project was proposed to a new council a year later, it ended up being approved. However, the cost of this delay was enormous, with construction costs increasing by a whopping $20.9 million due to inflation. With that, it's easy to see the issue here. Holding a long, unpredictable, and potentially chaotic public hearing for all these individual developments just seems like an excruciatingly tedious way to make decisions.
Well, I don't like Facebook, and I don't like the internet because I can't find a job.
Ma'am, we're discussing the rezoning for the Portillos. Do you have any comments on that?
For what?
That being said, many are also very concerned about losing public hearings because, well, what about democracy? For many, these public hearings are perceived as a very important democratic tradition. And I'm saying perceived here intentionally because, well, it turns out the real history of public hearings is actually much more rooted in protecting the interests of landowners. But anyways, today, many do see public hearings as an important cornerstone of our democracy. The government needs to listen to the people, and what better way to do that than literally listening to people? But if representing the public is the goal here, the public hearing is far from ideal because these meetings are not representative of the general public. A study by Einstein, not that Einstein, looked into the attendance at public hearings in 97 cities in the metro Boston area. It found that older, male, longtime residents, voters in local elections, and homeowners are significantly more likely to participate in these meetings. And here in BC, a study by SFU found that the average public hearing in Vancouver attracted only 6 speakers per project, a sample size that could accurately tell you the opinion of, well, 6 people. And that makes sense. Public hearings aren't exactly that convenient to attend. You first have to know when and where a meeting is happening, and then decide if you want to sacrifice an evening to attend a meeting that can last anywhere from an hour to several hours while you wait your turn to speak for a few minutes. The barriers here are numerous. What about the people who don't have free time and flexibility in their week? What about the people who have a fear of public speaking or face a language barrier? And what about the people who can't find childcare to drop off their kids for an afternoon because childcare facilities have been quashed by other public hearings? To name a completely random example. Because of that, public hearings are disproportionately attended by those who oppose a change. Those are the people who are motivated enough to attend. The same study by Einstein found that only 14.6% of attendees at public hearings spoke in support of new housing, all while 58% of the general public had actually voted in favor of more housing in a referendum. This is a huge challenge for projects that have widespread benefits but local impacts. Lots of people might benefit from having a daycare, but the people who show up to a public hearing for it are most likely going to be the neighbors who are more concerned about noise, traffic, and parking issues.
60 cars appearing from all directions trying to move the kids off. It's going to be a complete nuisance.
But as much as I understand the frustrations, I still think there is some validity to public hearings. Even though we might have broad consensus on how our city should change, there's still value in hearing from people who are directly impacted by those changes on the ground. In fact, how we approach public input today is colored by some tragic lessons learned from the past. In the 50s and 60s, heavy-handed approaches to planning led to cities demolishing entire neighborhoods that were deemed problematic by city officials. Case in point, in Vancouver, the local government created this map in the 1950s identifying areas of so-called blight throughout the city, neighborhoods they perceived as having fallen into disrepair and needing to be redeveloped.
The external and internal surveys revealed 2 areas of extreme decay, which form a destructive band of blight around the city center.
Their first priority was an area called Hogan's Alley, a diverse neighborhood that was a significant hub for the city's black community. Here, the city decided to expropriate the properties in this neighborhood and demolish it to make way for a new highway overpass. You can find similar stories throughout North America, like Africville in Halifax, the Bronx in New York, or the West End of Boston. These projects were done without much care to consult local communities, and they disproportionately impacted lower income and racialized neighborhoods. I think case studies like these are why many today have understandable fears about losing public hearings. Our cities are rife with examples of overzealous planning initiatives that literally and figuratively bulldozed over neighborhoods and their concerns. There's a very worthwhile conversation to be had here about how we balance the broader priorities of our city with the needs and concerns of individuals on the ground. But that gets me to my final issue with public hearings. If the goal here is to account for the needs and concerns of individuals and local communities, I would argue that the public hearing is still not that effective of a tool for one key reason. Elected officials are under no obligation to act on input from public hearings. Yes, your counselor could listen to your 5-minute speech and choose to ignore it. And the research suggests that in the vast majority of cases, that's exactly what happens. A study of public hearings in Vancouver, Surrey, Brampton, and Toronto found that resident opposition to development at public hearings does not result in substantial changes to development proposals. Another study by SFU found that 99% of projects that went to a public hearing in the city of Vancouver were approved, regardless of whether there was public opposition. Remember that public hearing for the social housing development in Vancouver that took 6 days? The majority of the 300 speakers and 1,500 letters opposed the project, but council still passed it. I think there's a reason why public hearings don't seem to have much influence. In most cases, a public hearing happens at the end of a process, just before councillors vote on a project. That's after the proposal has gone through a long process of review and input from city staff, committees, and multiple readings by the city council. So by the time the public hearing is held, all that's left for elected officials to do is vote yes or no. Because of that, the public hearing isn't really an opportunity for the public to give feedback or make changes to a project. It's too late for that. This is a yes or no vote on whether this project should happen at all, and the likelihood of your speech changing your councillor's vote at that point is pretty unlikely.
All those in favor, opposed, carried. Any other business?
So, in summary, public hearings just seem to fall short of the many noble expectations we have for them. First, they are not a way for the government to gauge broad public opinion. They tend to reflect a narrow subset of the population, typically from those with both the time and motivation to attend. And that motivation is typically opposition. Second, public hearings are not an effective way for members of the public to influence decisions by council. That's because they're held at the end of a project, and elected officials are under no obligation to act on their input. And finally, these flaws might not be such a big deal if there was no cost to holding a public hearing, but the reality is that there is a huge cost. The delays and risk placed on critically important projects, all caused by a process that is arguably just theater. So, what do we do moving forward? Well, like I mentioned earlier, some places like British Columbia are literally banning public hearings for housing projects if they're aligned with the city's official community plan. It turns out municipalities in BC actually create overarching plans for how their city should develop with a public hearing. But once that plan is made, developments that align with that plan still have to go through another public hearing. Well, with these changes, that will no longer be the case. And while I think that's an understandable move, I also hope we don't lose sight of the idea that the general public should have a say in how their city develops. I think the goal here shouldn't be to provide fewer opportunities for public input, but more representative, more effective, and frankly, more efficient opportunities for that input. In this day and age, it does feel a bit archaic to rely on people physically showing up at a designated time, speaking one after the other, just for our government to get a sense of what the public thinks about a project. I'm probably stating the obvious here, but with the advent of the internet, there is just so much more discourse happening about our cities online. So if we do move away from public hearings, I hope we consider using more online platforms for collecting input instead. And if we really want that input to matter, we should hear it earlier, when projects are still flexible and can actually incorporate feedback. I partnered with Simon Fraser University's Renovate the Public Hearing initiative to put this video together, and as part of the story, I had a chance to learn about a new model for public input that they're studying, the Residents' Assembly. Under that model, a group of individuals are randomly selected from a pool of volunteers. They come together to learn about and discuss a given topic and present recommendations to decision makers. SFU conducted case studies of this model in 3 different municipalities. In Gibson's, the town's resident assembly met regularly to learn about priorities and trade-offs to incorporate into the town's official community plan.
The Gibsons Residents Assembly was a partnership with the town of Gibsons that convened 25 randomly selected residents and had them convene and really tackle the question, how can Gibsons grow and meet its housing needs for the future? They were able to deliberate, learn, and actually build consensus on 6 final recommendations, which was unanimously approved as a part of the process in updating the official community plan.
You can learn more about their work at renovatethepublichearing.ca. Now, admittedly, there is no perfect solution here. Each approach to gathering public input does come with trade-offs that we should carefully consider. This discussion on public hearings ultimately opens up a much larger and important conversation on what our democracy looks like at the most local level. But at the end of the day, I think what we can all agree on is that a healthy democracy is one where the government listens to the people. So when we evaluate our democratic processes, I think it's important to ask whether the government is actually listening to people or if it only looks like it.
Forget the analytics, do my thing, don't listen to the critic. Touch my phone, it's hella parasitic. Reach that peak before they see me finish. Forget the analytics, do my thing, don't listen to the critic. Touch my phone,